Tust. In 1963, a man in a small Turkish village was doing renovations on his house. Knocking through a wall in his basement, he found another room behind it. That happens sometimes. Old houses have strange histories. But then he found another room beyond that, then a corridor. And then the corridor kept going. What he had broken through wasn't a hidden storage space, or a forgotten cellar. It was the entrance to one of the largest underground cities ever discovered on Earth. That city is called Derinkuyu. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are, whatever hour it is, drop a comment and tell me. I genuinely check them, of course. There's something about this kind of story that feels right to listen to in the quiet hours. And I like knowing where people are when they find it. Berlin at midnight, Melbourne at sunrise. Somewhere in the middle of the country with the lights off. All of it. And if you want to hear these without any ads, without any background music, just the story, I put the full versions on Spotify. Link is in the description. It's free to follow, and it's honestly the best way to support what I'm doing here. Now, back underground, Derinkuyu. Derinkuyu sits beneath the Cappadocia region of central Turkey. In a landscape that already looks like it belongs to another world, the surface is famous for its fairy-chimneys, those tall, narrow spires of soft volcanic rock that have been carved by wind and rain over millions of years into shapes that seem almost deliberate. People have been living in and around this rock for a very long time. What's below the ground is something else entirely. The city goes down approximately 85 metres. That's roughly the height of a 25-storey building, inverted. There are up to 18 distinct levels carved into the soft volcanic stone. Not all of them have been fully excavated or opened to the public. Estimates of its capacity vary, but historians and archaeologists have suggested it could have sheltered somewhere in the range of 20,000 people, possibly more, along with their livestock, stables, food stores, wells, ventilation shafts, chapels, wineries, schools and meeting rooms. All of it underground, all of it in the dark. The scale of that takes a moment to settle in. This wasn't a tunnel. It wasn't a bunker or a hideout in the conventional sense. It was a city. A functioning, organised, inhabited city built downward instead of upward, in a place where the rock was soft enough to carve but solid enough to hold. The people who built it weren't primitive. They were engineers. They solved problems of air and water and waste and light in an environment that had no margin for error. You get the ventilation wrong, people suffocate. You get the water supply wrong. People die of thirst or disease. You get the structural calculations wrong. The ceiling comes down. None of those things happened. Derinkuyu stood. The questions that follow from that fact are the ones this story is really about. Who started digging? When did the digging begin? Who expanded it over time, level by level, and why? What was happening above ground that made it worth the enormous effort of moving underground? And perhaps most interestingly, what threats were so persistent, so serious, so hard to fight in the open, that a community would choose to build their entire life below the surface, rather than face those threats head on? Some of those questions have answers, or at least partial ones. We have archaeological evidence, historical records, comparative dating of artifacts, architectural analysis. There are things we can say with reasonable confidence about when certain levels were in use and who was using them. Byzantine period. Roughly the 7th through the 10th centuries left clear traces. The region's history of conquest and religious conflict lines up with what the underground spaces seem to have been designed for. But other questions are harder. The earliest levels are the most difficult to date. Some researchers have proposed origins stretching back to the Phrygians around the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era. Others have pushed earlier still, though the further back those claims go, the thinner the direct evidence becomes. And then there are the fringe theories, the ones about lost civilizations and prehistoric engineering, which get passed around online and occasionally in books. We'll get to those. We'll treat them exactly as the evidence treats them, which is to say, interesting ideas that haven't been proven. What I want to do in this story is stay close to what the ground actually tells us, just the dramatic facts. Though there are plenty of those, but the texture of life in a place like this, what it felt like to move through those tunnels, how air reached rooms 80 metres below the surface, how a door the size of a millstone could be rolled across a corridor from the inside to stop an army, how people kept animals underground, how they stored food, practiced their faith, raised children, in a city that the sky could never see. That's the story. And it starts with a wall that opened into something much larger than anyone expected. Before you can understand what's below, you need to understand what's above. Cappadocia sits in the middle of Anatolia, roughly in the geographic heart of modern Turkey. Not near the coast, not near any major river system that would make it obviously desirable. Not on the kind of fertile plain that typically draws dense settlement. It's a plateau, elevated, semi-arid, surrounded by volcanic peaks, and it sits in a bowl of geological history that shaped everything about how people lived there. The rock itself is the starting point. Millions of years ago, a series of volcanic eruptions blanketed this region in ash and debris. Over time, that material compressed and solidified into a stone called tough post. It's soft by the standards of most building materials. You can carve it with basic tools. A determined person with iron implements can move through it at a meaningful pace, shaping rooms and corridors and passages, without the kind of industrial effort you'd need to cut granite or basalt. Tough has a second property that matters just as much. When it's exposed to air, it hardens. What starts as a freshly cut surface, slightly damp and workable, gradually becomes more rigid and stable. That means a room carved into tuff doesn't just stay open, it slowly strengthens. The act of excavation and the act of construction are happening at the same time. That's why the underground was possible here specifically, not because the people of Cappadocia were uniquely ingenious. Though the engineering they eventually produced was remarkable because the geology cooperated. The rock gave them both the opportunity and the structural reliability to go deep and stay there. Above ground, that same tuff eroded into the landscape that makes Cappadocia one of the most visually striking places on Earth. Wind and rain worked at the softer material over millions of years, leaving behind the taller, harder formations. Those fairy chimneys, capped spires, and cone-shaped towers that rise across the valleys in clusters. People recognized early that the same rock you could carve downward, you could also carve horizontally, cliff faces, and the freestanding formations throughout the region are riddled with hand-cut rooms, storage chambers, and eventually chapels and entire monasteries. The surface and the underground weren't separate ideas. They were the same idea, applied in different directions. Geographically, the valleys of Cappadocia, including the Goremi Valley, the Ihlara Canyon, broad open terrain around what is now the town of Derinkuyu itself, sit at elevations that bring cold winters and dry summers. Rainfall is modest. The growing season is real but not generous. This isn't a place where food simply arrives. It's a place where food has to be managed, stored carefully, protected from heat and cold, and the kinds of raids that follow wherever there are stored goods worth taking. That pressure shaped daily life in ways that made underground space useful even during peaceful periods. The plateau's temperature underground stays relatively constant year-round. Cools in summer, above freezing in winter. If you're storing grain, wine, dried food for a household or a village, that stability is enormously valuable. Cost. A natural or hand-carved cellar in this rock is better than almost any above-ground storage solution available without modern refrigeration. So from very early in the region's settlement history, people were using underground chambers not as refuges from danger, but as ordinary infrastructure. The root cellar logic applied to an entire plateau. Animals complicated the picture in the same way they complicate everything in pre-industrial farming. You need them close enough to tend and feed. You need to protect them from theft and predators. Hard. You need their warmth in winter and their labour year-round. Above ground, a village in Cappadocia would have had its houses, its common spaces, terraced or irrigated fields, where the terrain allowed, and its stables. What the underground eventually offered was a way to extend that domestic logic downward, to bring animals and stores and people into a space that could be sealed and defended and insulated from both weather and violence at the same time. Human footprint in this region stretches back a very long time. Hittites were here, Phrygians were here. There is evidence of continuous habitation across multiple civilizations, each one adapting to the same basic landscape constraints, the same shortage of surface water, the same exposure to whatever was moving across Anatolia at any given century. Cappadocia was never at the edge of the world. It was close enough to major routes through Anatolia to be affected by whatever moved along them: armies, migrations, trade caravans, religious upheaval, and far enough from the centres of power that it could never simply rely on being protected, that geography produced a particular kind of community. Not isolated, but also not secure. People here were practiced at contingency thinking. They had to be. You store enough food for 2 bad years. Not one. You know where the water sources are, and you know which ones are hidden. Well, you build in ways that account for the possibility that you may need to disappear for a while and reappear when the danger has passed. This is where the pairing of surface and underground becomes the key idea. Derinkuyu and the other underground cities of Cappadocia weren't alternatives to life above ground. They were the other half of it. The villages on the surface and the spaces below were designed to work together. People didn't move underground and stay there indefinitely. They moved between the two as conditions demanded. Surface life for the ordinary rhythms of farming and community. Underground life, when something interrupted those rhythms badly enough to require it. The hiding, in other words, wasn't always desperate. Some of it was planned. Some of it was seasonal or precautionary. You bring the livestock down when the raiders come through in autumn. Store the harvest below, where it stays cool and can't be burned. You have a place to go that an enemy approaching from the surface can see no sign of. The danger and the planning were two sides of the same response to the same basic fact about where these people lived. And understanding that, the above-ground life, the rock, the climate, The history of movement across Anatolia is what makes what they built underground make sense. Not as a miracle, as a solution. For most of modern history, Derinkuyu was something else entirely. It was just a town. A small Anatolian settlement, whitewashed houses, narrow streets, a church, a mosque, the usual strata of life built on older foundations. People knew there were cellars. They knew that some of those cellars went deeper than others. Cappadocia. Almost every old house sits over some kind of dugout space. You store potatoes. You keep wine, cool room for the worst of the summer heat. That's ordinary. That's not a secret. So when the rediscovery story begins in 1963, it doesn't start with someone hunting for a lost city. It starts with a homeowner who wanted a bit more practical space. Basic outline is simple and well attested. In the early 1960s, in what was then a relatively poor and unremarkable town, a man decided to renovate. Different versions say he was expanding his basement, adding a new room, or knocking down a wall to make space for a storage area. All of those are plausible in a place where the rock lends itself to almost casual excavation. You can chip away at tough with a lawn tool and feel like you're just shaving stone, not tunneling into history. At some point during that renovation, he broke through. Behind one of the walls, instead of compacted tuff, there was a void. Not a clean doorway, not a neatly framed entrance, but a rough breach opening into a low passage. Cold air moved differently in that space. The acoustics changed. You know the feeling if you've ever stepped from a small cellar into something larger you didn't expect. Your voice doesn't come back the same way. The darkness feels less like a corner and more like a direction. From here, the story starts to split into versions. Popular retellings like to add drama. In some, the homeowner's chickens vanish, and he knocks down the wall, trying to find where they went, only to discover an entire city. In others, he notices a draft and a hollow sound when he taps one section of stone, and curiosity pushes him through. These details are embroidery. There's no contemporary written account from the man himself carefully describing runaway poultry or mysterious breezes. We have, mostly. Is the later testimony of locals and the recollection of early investigators. A renovation, a breached wall, space beyond that, clearly wasn't just one more household cellar. What is consistent across the less embellished accounts is the impression of scale. Once that initial opening was widened enough to pass through safely, the homeowner, and then others, saw more than a single extra room. There were corridors, stretching away, branching, bending. There were chambers that didn't feel like they belonged to one family or one generation. Ceiling heights varied, floor levels shifted, and the sense of down was surprisingly insistent. The further you went, more you felt that you weren't just under your own house anymore. You were under the town. That is the unsettling part people remember. Skeletons in the walls or piles of artifacts glowing in torchlight. Just the realization that beneath an ordinary neighbourhood there was an older, larger architecture whose boundaries you couldn't see. This was not, to be clear, the first time anyone in Derinkuyu had ever encountered deep underground spaces. Local farmers and shepherds knew of larger caverns outside town. Children grew up hearing about strange holes in the ground where you weren't to play. But those were scattered places, half remembered and treated as curiosities or hazards. What 1963 did was focus attention, turn the vague idea that there are some old caves around here into a concrete fact. There is something systematized and enormous under our feet. The next phase is less romantic and more bureaucratic. It's the part that made Derinkuyu a documented site rather than a persistent rumour. Word reached local officials. In Turkey, archaeological responsibility ultimately leads to regional museum directorates and the Ministry of Culture. Inspectors came, trained archaeologists. They widened passages more carefully, stabilised entrances, and began the slow process of mapping and recording. Early reports from the mid-1960s describe multiple levels, large communal spaces, ventilation shafts, features that were clearly not accidental hollows, stables with tethering rings carved into the rock, vertical shafts that connected floors, and those famous round stone doors that could be rolled into place to seal corridors. At first, the language in official documents was cautious. Term underground city appears, but usually with qualifiers. They were still measuring. They were still trying to determine whether this was one coherent complex or a patchwork of separate excavations linked over time. Depth estimates and level counts shifted as new connections were found. The figure that eventually settled, about 18 stories, reaching roughly 85 metres down, is the product of decades of subsequent surveying, not something announced the week after the wall came down. Meanwhile, the story was spreading in a different form. For locals, Derinkuyu's underground quickly became a point of pride and a source of income. For travel writers and popular magazines, it became a ready-made legend. Each retelling added something. In one, the homeowner's dog disappears and is heard barking from behind the wall. In another, he finds centuries-old tools sitting exactly where the last workers supposedly left them. These details make for good narrative. They're not backed by the early archaeological reports. What those reports do mention are soot-blackened ceilings, niches carved for oil lamps, and evidence of long occupation and later abandonment. So when you hear about the 1963 rediscovery, it helps to separate three layers. There is the core. A man altering his house, a breached wall, a passage into man-made rock-cut spaces that turned out to be immense. There is the local memory and oral history. People who always knew there was something under parts of town never connected the pieces into a single mapped whole. And there is the later storytelling. The chickens, the lost dog, the dramatic solitary explorer, walking deeper and deeper by candlelight. Atmospheric, but not necessary to explain what actually happened. Once the site was recognised, everything above it began to change. Engineers and archaeologists worked together to understand how far the voids extended under the modern settlement. Some areas were reinforced, others were closed off. Entrances were formalised. By the 1970s, portions of Derinkuyu were open to visitors as a controlled archaeological and tourist site. Walkways, lighting, and safety barriers were installed in ways that inevitably altered the raw experience, but made systematic access possible. That shift from hidden infrastructure to managed heritage also changed the questions people asked. Instead of, is there really something under that house? The questions became, how big is this? When was it first dug? Who lived here? And how does it relate to all the other underground spaces in Cappadocia? The mapping of Derinkuyu revealed not just its internal complexity, also its connections outward, including long tunnels leading toward other sites like Cappadocia. As researchers traced those links, the 1963 breach in a single basement wall turned out to be the entry point, historically speaking, to a network of more than 200 known underground settlements across the region. In other words, the rediscovery didn't just give us one remarkable site. It provided the anchor for an entire way of seeing Cappadocia's subterranean landscape. Archaeologists had Derinkuyu as a reference point. They could compare features: ventilation systems, stone doors, chapels, wineries, storage rooms, wells. They could build typologies and relative chronologies. Tourism followed naturally, and with it both funding and pressure, the need to protect, to interpret, to simplify a very complicated story for visitors walking through floodlit corridors that had once been dark. But under the glass cases and guidebook summaries, the core moment remains surprisingly ordinary. A person altered a wall in a familiar, practical way and discovered that the space he thought he knew was not the whole of it, and planning and a history that had been literally underfoot all along. To understand what he stumbled into, you have to look at how it was arranged. The levels, functions, the way an underground city was laid out like a vertical village. If you strip away the mystery for a moment and think like an engineer, an underground city has 3 basic problems to solve. You need air, you need movement, and you need to put the right kinds of rooms in the right places so life can actually function. Derinkuyu does all 3 by going vertical. Instead of a flat maze like a subway system, it's more like a stack of villages threaded by shafts. From the surface down to roughly 85 meters, archaeologists identify on the order of 18 distinct floors or levels, FOST. These aren't like the stories in a modern apartment block with clean floor slabs and stairwells. They're bands of activity, zones perched along a spine of rock, connected by tunnels, ramps, and those tight stair-like passages that make every step downward feel deliberate. Imagine starting at the modern entrance and following that spine down. At the very top, just below ground level, are spaces that make sense close to the surface. Stables where animals could be brought in quickly, storage rooms, crushing areas, a winery, places where heavy, smelly, or noisy activities could happen without dragging the problem deep into the complex. You see tethering holes carved into the walls, low ceilings to keep animals calm, wider chambers that could handle groups of people coming and going. Drop a level or 2, and the rooms begin to cluster more like domestic spaces. There are long, narrow corridors leading to suites of small chambers, each one capable of being closed off. Niches for lamps, carved benches, and low platforms that were probably used as sleeping or sitting areas, openings in ceilings and floors that connect you to the spaces above and below, some of them with carved steps, others with simple hand and footholds. Over and over you see a pattern, vertical shaft, then branching corridor, then a cluster of specialized rooms. Some clusters look like kitchens and communal eating spaces. Blackened ceilings from soot, shallow basins in the floor, recesses that could have held jars. Others have features that look like workshops or storage depots, raised platforms, wall-cut shelves, deep silos for grain. Deeper still you find chapels carved into the rock, with apses and crosses, evidence of Christian use in Byzantine times. Somewhere between the mid-levels and the deepest parts, you encounter wells and cisterns, water sources that tie the whole system to the surface aquifers. The city is not one continuous open space. It's a series of decisions. You descend through a narrow passage that forces single-file movement. It widens into a room where multiple corridors meet. You choose one and end up in a larger communal chamber. Behind that, another bottleneck, another decision point. The geometry is doing 2 jobs at once. It organises daily traffic when life is calm, and it controls movement if danger ever comes from above. This, as is where those rolling stone doors make sense. Many of them sit at choke points between levels, not at the outermost entrance. Round block of rock can be rolled into place and levered into a groove, sealing a passage from the inside. Behind that door, corridor may turn sharply, forcing anyone who breaches it to funnel into a tight, easily defended angle. You can feel the defensive logic in the floor plan. It's not just about getting people in. It's about being able to slow, confuse, and contain anyone unwelcome. Capacity estimates come from this architecture. If you count sleeping platforms, room sizes, storage volume, and the sheer spread of passages and chambers, you get the often quoted figure. Up to around 20,000 people, plus their animals, could have sheltered here at once. As some writers push that number higher, some pull it lower, because the math depends on assumptions. How much floor space per person do you allow? Are you imagining absolute emergency crush conditions for a brief refuge, something like sustainable, long-term living? Archaeologists tend to give ranges rather than hard numbers. Maybe it could handle several thousand people comfortably for extended periods, and far more for short crises. The livestock complicate things. Stables take up space. Animals need fodder and air. You can't simply pack humans in every available room and call it a population figure. Storage capacity also matters. The more grain silos and jars you count, the clearer it is that planners expected at least weeks or months of possible underground life, not just a night or two. Movement and wayfinding. Visitors today move along a curated route, lit and signposted. Historically, it would have been much more intuitive. If you grew up with it, the corridors are narrow by design, post. Many are only wide enough for one or two people to pass at a time. Stair-like slopes can be steep, forcing you to watch your footing. Some intersections are deliberately confusing, with multiple low tunnels branching off at different angles and heights. If you don't know where you're going, you can easily find yourself doubled back. One level off from where you thought you were. That's a defensive advantage. It's also a clue about how the city was probably used. Derinkuyu were designed as a fully permanent underground residence for tens of thousands of people. You might expect more open circulation, more generous public spaces on every level, more evidence of routine daily life in the deepest areas. Instead, what we see is a gradient. The upper and mid-levels hold most of the obviously domestic and economic spaces. The very deepest levels, down near that 85-metre mark, tend to be more specialised. Additional storerooms, isolated chambers, hidden niches, possibly spaces reserved for times of extreme danger. This feeds into one of the central interpretive debates. Derinkuyu, a true subterranean city where people lived year-round, or a refuge system used periodically? The architecture itself doesn't give a simple answer. It supports both functions to some degree. The presence of chapels, wineries, organised stables, extensive storage suggests serious, repeated use, not a purely theoretical bunker. At the same time, the narrow bottlenecks, the heavy emphasis on defensible passageways, and the sheer extremity of the deepest levels make more sense. If we imagine people going underground when they had to, during raids, during specific seasons, during political or military crises, and then returning to surface life when conditions allowed. What the levels tell us, more than anything, is that Derinkuyu was planned with layers of risk in mind. Every story down buys more security at the cost of comfort and convenience. Each band of rooms answers a different question. Where do we put the animals? Where do we store the grain? Where do we gather to worship? Where do we retreat if the worst happens. Vertical organization is the map of those priorities carved into stone. And threaded through all of it, from the surface courtyards to the deepest sealed chambers, are the lifelines that make such a design even possible, the shafts that keep air moving in the dark. If you've ever stepped just a few meters into a cave and felt that heavy stillness, you know what the first non-negotiable problem is. Air doesn't move itself. On the surface, wind and temperature changes stir the atmosphere for free. Underground, rock blocks most of that motion. In a dead-end tunnel, with a group of people and a few lamps, the oxygen drops and the carbon dioxide builds up faster than you'd think. Add animals, cooking fires, moisture from hundreds of breathing bodies, and you have a recipe for headaches, dizziness, and, eventually, suffocation. Derinkuyu only works because its builders understood this, at least in practical terms, and turned the rock itself into a lung. Running through the complex are vertical shafts, narrow, deep cuts that connect different levels, and in some cases reach all the way to the surface. Archaeologists have identified multiple such shafts in Derinkuyu, some more than 50 or 55 meters deep, cross-sections small enough that a person could not easily climb, but wide enough to allow substantial air movement. We can see these directly. They're there, in the ceilings of chambers as circular or roughly rectangular openings. They appear in corridors as narrow chimneys. Some widen into irregular shafts whose full extent is hard to trace, because later construction has cut into them. In a few places, you can look up and see a string of openings that line up from level to level, like vertebrae in a stone spine. What we don't see are labels saying, "This is a ventilation duct." The interpretation comes from patterns. First, placement. Many shafts pierce multiple stories, but avoid directly connecting to major surface courtyards. Instead, they open into small, controlled spaces on the upper levels, or even into buildings that no longer survive on the surface. That suggests a deliberate attempt to get air from above without creating big, obvious holes that an enemy could exploit. Second, continuity. When archaeologists map the shafts against the layout of rooms, you see that almost every dense cluster of chambers is within reasonable distance of one. Areas far from shafts tend to be storage, transitional corridors, or short runs of passage, not large communal rooms where people would linger for long stretches. And third, environmental effect. Even today, with many original openings blocked or altered, you can feel slight drafts in certain corridors. Temperature in the deeper levels hovers around a stable, cool range, often quoted at roughly 13 degrees Celsius. Regardless of surface weather, stability tells us air is exchanging, slowly but reliably, between inside and outside. The physics are simple enough. One part of the system opens to cooler, denser air, and another to slightly warmer or sun-heated zones. You get a gentle pressure difference. Warm air tends to rise, cold air sinks. In a vertical structure with multiple shafts of varying depth and orientation, small differences add up to a constant, low-level circulation. You don't need mechanical fans. You just need enough height difference and enough carefully placed openings. But in Derinkuyu, these shafts were doing more than just breathing. Many of them doubled as communication lines. A narrow shaft between two levels is a perfect sound channel. People on different stories could speak or shout up and down, passing warnings or instructions without physically moving. Ancient sources don't describe these conversations, but acoustically it makes sense. Modern experiments in similar spaces show that voices carry well in straight stone-lined chimneys. Some shafts also intersected corridors in ways that suggest control. If you can reach a shaft's mouth from a guarded chamber, you can decide who uses it, who approaches it, and even whether anything drops or rises through it. In a siege, that matters. Shaft, that primarily brings air, can, in desperate circumstances, also be a narrow resupply route, a way to lower messages, water skins, even small sacks of grain. And the reverse is true. If enemies get access to a shaft from above, they might try to pour in smoke, fire, or debris, designing openings small, offset, and reachable. Only from interior-controlled spaces reduces that risk. Balance between necessity and vulnerability is clearest when you think about fire. Fire is both essential and dangerous underground. People need heat, light, cooked food. Archaeologists see direct evidence of open flame use in Derinkuyu, soot-blackened ceilings in some mid-level rooms, charcoal traces in floor depressions, and lamp niches with burn marks. But not every room is stained. The distribution is patchy, suggesting that fires were clustered in controlled zones rather than scattered everywhere. This fits what you'd expect if you're trying not to choke yourself. If you light a smoky, wood-burning fire in a deep, poorly ventilated chamber, the smoke has nowhere to go. It will follow the same pressure-driven air currents that bring you oxygen, but much faster. Psst. That means smoky activities had to be placed where exhaust could reach a shaft mouth, or at least a higher-level corridor that eventually tied into one. The evidence seems to support this kind of zoning. Some areas with heavy soot lie near identifiable shafts or at points where passage ceilings rise toward them. Others are located on upper levels, closer to surface vents and entrances, where a simple cross-draft between two openings could clear smoke more effectively. Deeper chambers tend to have fewer heavy soot marks, which aligns with the idea that the deepest levels were for storage, refuge, or ritual, not daily cooking. Here is where it's useful to separate what we can see from what we're inferring. Direct observations include the number and geometry of shafts, their intersections with rooms and corridors, the presence and thickness of soot deposits, relative humidity and temperature today, and the way air seems to move when multiple openings are left unsealed. We know, for instance, that underground environments like Derinkuyu tend to maintain a fairly constant, just year-round, and relatively high humidity compared to the surface. From that, we can infer livability features. Stable, cool temperatures are good for sleep in crowded spaces. People don't overheat as easily as they would in sun-baked houses. Grain, wine, and certain foods keep better at consistent, cool conditions, especially away from insects and sudden temperature swings. On the other hand, high humidity paired with poor airflow is bad for lungs and for stored goods, encouraging mold and disease. Very fact that Derinkuyu has extensive storage areas deep inside implies that its ventilation was good enough to keep dampness within tolerable limits, at least during the seasons it was used most intensely. We don't have written plans by ancient Cappadocian engineers explaining all this. There is no surviving manual saying, "Put granaries near this shaft because air here is best." But when you overlay the map of rooms with the map of shafts, and then overlay both with soot traces and water sources, a coherent logic emerges. Clean air, smoke outlets, cool storage, and communication all converge around those vertical cuts in the rock. In a sense, everything else in Derinkuyu is optional architecture. Stables, chapels, cellars, bedrooms. None of it works for long without the invisible infrastructure. The true skeleton of the city isn't just the stacked levels we move through. It's the hidden voids that let air slide past stone in the dark, turning a suffocating warren into a place where thousands of people could, at least for a time, breathe, sleep, and wait. Air solves one basic problem, staying alive hour by hour. The next problem is staying alive when someone wants you dead. If the ventilation shafts are Derinkuyu's lungs, its doors are something like clenched fists. Not the wooden planks or small modern gates you see when you visit today, but the original security system carved straight out of the volcanic tuff. The rolling stone doors. Archaeologists and visitors describe them as looking like giant millstones, but that comparison misses how strange they really are. Imagine a huge circular slab of rock, maybe 1 to 1.5 meters across, roughly the height of an adult's chest, and anywhere between 30 and 50 centimeters thick. Some weigh several hundred kilos. Estimates often run in the range of half a ton or more. They're not just sitting in the middle of corridors. They're tucked sideways into specially cut pockets in the walls, like enormous coins slid halfway into a slot. Most of the time these stones don't stand in the centre of a passage. Instead, the corridor narrows just before the doorway and bends slightly. The stone sits in a recessed groove, hidden until someone on the inside decides to move it. That's the important part. From the inside. The rock is not simply resting on the floor, framed by shallow channels in the floor and ceiling, sometimes in the walls, that act as tracks. When you push from within, the stone rolls forward, guided by those grooves, until it settles into a carefully shaped notch opposite its storage pocket. In that locked position, blocks almost the entire width and height of the passage. On the outside, attackers would face a flat wall of stone with no obvious handles. On the inside, the builders gave themselves options. Many of these doors have a central hole, small and deeply cut. That opening could have multiple uses. It lets defenders look out or talk to anyone outside without opening the door. It allows a spear, pole, or other weapon to be thrust through. And it offers a place where a stout bar or beam could be wedged to help lever the door back into its pocket when the danger had passed. What makes the system so effective isn't just the stones themselves. It's where they are. Derinkuyu's designers understood choke points instinctively. The deeper levels are reached through a series of narrow tunnels, often so tight that two adults can't walk side by side. Ceilings dip low enough that most modern visitors have to hunch or bend. Corridors kink and angle instead of running straight. It's inconvenient when you're just touring. In a fight, it's brutal design. Place a rolling stone door at the end of one of these cramped sloping passages and you've built a perfect kill zone. One defender with a spear or bow can control a line of attackers who are forced to advance single file, bent over, almost no freedom to swing weapons. If the door closes while intruders are still in the tunnel, those in front are trapped against it while those behind can't easily retreat. From hidden side chambers, or from behind the door's central hole, defenders could jab, throw, or simply wait while panic and claustrophobia do the rest. Now imagine not one such door, but many. Maps of Derinkuyu show rolling stone doors scattered across multiple levels, concentrated at key junctions. Near primary entrances, the thresholds between major clusters of rooms, and at points where passageways narrow sharply. Closing them in sequence would create layered barriers, even if an enemy forced one door. No easy feat with limited leverage in a tight tunnel would emerge into another constricted space, facing another sealed disk of rock. This is not the architecture of people who live every day in open war. It's the architecture of people who assume that, now and then, the surface might become unsafe. How long could they stay below with those doors rolled shut? We don't have a timetable carved on the walls. We can sketch the logic. Food storage areas in Derinkuyu include what appear to be granaries, wine presses, oil production niches, long trough-like spaces that could serve as bins. Stable areas near the upper levels point to the presence of animals, both a food source and a risk. Because animals require air, water, and fodder. Wells and cisterns, which we'll talk about later, suggest access to water, independent of surface control. If a community planned in advance, keeping stores stocked, stations organised, they might endure weeks or possibly months underground during a crisis. But endurance isn't just a matter of calories, it's about behaviour. Noise would have to be minimised. A quiet city is harder to detect from above, especially if entrances are concealed or appear abandoned. Lamp use would need to be rationed. Oil and wicks are consumables, and smoke, even with good ventilation, adds up. Movement would likely be zoned by level and time of day. Children would need to be kept occupied in tight, dark conditions. Disease, always a threat in crowded spaces, would be managed by separating the sick where possible. Closed doors become social tools as much as military ones. Sealing off certain levels not only from invaders, but from domestic chaos. Family cluster could be isolated from others. Livestock areas might be partially segregated to limit smell and noise. Narrow, defendable corridors would double as quiet boundaries. Between sleeping zones and workspaces, it's easy to look to all this. And imagine people in a constant state of siege, living every moment as if attack were imminent. Human psychology doesn't work well under permanent emergency. And the archaeological record doesn't show an endless layer of burned debris or smashed weapons in Derinkuyu. What the doors tell us is less about daily life and more about risk management, defence. Features like these are the stone equivalent of seat belts and fire exits. Most of the time they aren't in active use. Massive discs would probably sit in their wall recesses, the passage open, life going on, with people walking past them the way we pass stairwells and emergency doors without thinking. Generations might go by without anyone needing to close all of them at once. But the fact that they exist, that they are repeated through the complex, tells us that communities expected periods, maybe seasonal, maybe generational, when retreat and closure were the safest options. Those periods were shaped by the kinds of threats common in Cappadocia over many centuries. This interior plateau sat at crossroads, not edges. Caravans passed through. Empires rose and fell around it. Armies moved along main routes. Bandit groups, tribal raiders, and later small warbands could appear with little warning. Written sources from broader Anatolia and neighbouring regions, across different eras, mention raids, tax-collecting expeditions, local feuds, religious conflicts, and the general insecurity of borderlands and frontier zones. We can't always tie a specific door in Derinkuyu to a specific named invader, and scholars are cautious about doing so. The pattern of fortification, hidden entrances, twisty approach tunnels, rolling stones, choke points, aligns well with a landscape where danger often came as fast, unpredictable violence. A passing force looking for supplies, captives, strategic high point. Under those conditions and bells, the goal isn't to build an underground fortress where you fight heroic last stands. It's to build a place where the surface for a time simply stops offering targets. From the outside, raiding party might see only a scattering of modest stone houses. On a windswept plateau, doors barred, windows empty. Maybe a few abandoned animals, people, the grain, the tools, the religious objects, the community's memory. Those have flowed downwards behind doors that roll to tunnels that funnel into chambers whose stones remember how to wait. Air and doors solve part of the siege problem. Water decides how long the solution works. Derinkuyu is not dug randomly into dry rock. Within this 18-story stack of rooms and passages, archaeologists have identified multiple wells and water shafts, some plunging deep, some shallow, some apparently isolated from the surface, others very likely once connected to it. At first glance, that sounds ideal. You have an underground city, and inside it, your own built-in taps. No need to sneak out at night with jars, no need to bargain with whoever controls the nearest spring. Water is as much a security question as a survival one. In many reconstructions, people imagine the wells simply as straight tubes from the deepest levels up to the surface, like sipping through a straw. Reality appears more complex. Some wells in Derinkuyu seem to stop on the lower levels, with no obvious continuation to the modern ground surface. Others rise through the structure, and only become accessible from certain floors, not from every passage that crosses their line. One interpretation, favoured by some researchers, is that at least part of Derinkuyu's water was deliberately decoupled from the immediate surface, instead of tapping a shallow, exposed source that a hossus force could poison in a single act. The builders may have been reaching down to the local water table, using shafts that could be sealed or concealed higher up, in a region of soft volcanic tuff over harder layers and aquifers. That makes geological sense. Cappadocia's surface is dotted with traditional village wells that reach groundwater at varying depths. It isn't difficult to imagine the same knowledge applied in reverse. Instead of digging down from a courtyard, you start lower, in an underground gallery, and cut sideways or deeper into the same saturated layers. If that's right, then some of Derinkuyu's wells were not just conveniences. They were strategic assets. You could close the rolling stone doors, retreat to the protected levels, and still have access to drinkable water that an enemy on the plateau couldn't easily reach or spoil. But not all water sources look equally secure. Several shafts, when traced upwards, intersect what are now open courtyards or house floors in the modern town, built above Derinkuyu. Local residents used some of these as ordinary village wells, long before anyone realised there was a multi-level city beneath their feet. That's how the place was rediscovered in 1963. A collapsed interior wall, a hidden passage, then a realisation that the well was just a small part of something much larger. This creates an obvious problem in a raid scenario. Any water, a host, the boundary point that crosses the boundary between underground refuge and open settlement, becomes a potential vulnerability. Determined attacker might try to drop refuse, animal carcasses, or simply dirt into a shaft. Even rumours that a well had been tampered with could make people hesitant to drink from it during a crisis. And then there's the problem of being found. A completely hidden community is safest if nobody knows it exists. Wells that open in courtyards, people regularly drawing water, talking, shouting, and leading animals are natural hubs of surface life. Noise and movement cluster around them. Raiders arrive and see repeated traffic converging on one spot, or discover that a well behaves strangely. Echoes, drafts, timings of use that might raise questions. Here, scholars tend to draw careful lines, straightforward to map where the wells and channels are today, which levels they connect, and which ones line up with surface features. That's the physical evidence. What's debated is the intention behind their layout. Were some shafts originally open at the surface and later closed? Were others always meant to be blind, accessible only from within? Did people routinely use surface-connected wells during peaceful times, then switch to more protected sources when danger loomed? We don't have written plans or builders' notes, so most reconstructions are best treated as informed hypotheses, not certainties. Still, we can sketch some reasonable scenarios based on how water shapes behaviour. For short stays underground, days, maybe a couple of weeks, cisterns and stored water might suffice. Cappadocian rock is good at holding carved basins. Runoff and overflow could be collected, and wines and other liquids add a buffer. In that case, surface-connected wells could be avoided entirely during a tense period. Doors roll shut. Access points to vulnerable shafts are blocked from below. People live off what's already inside. For longer occupations, several weeks into months, you need a more resilient solution. That's where deeper, more isolated wells become crucial. Communities that expected extended military campaigns or repeated cycles of raiding season after raiding season would have the strongest incentive to invest in shafts that penetrated down to relatively clean, stable groundwater, independent of what was happening in a village square above. Here the line between temporary refuge and semi-habitual living starts to blur. If your underground complex offers not only shelter and stores, but also dependable, reasonably safe water, the temptation grows to treat it as more than an occasional bolt hole. You might sleep above ground in peaceful years, using the city beneath, mainly for storage and ritual. But the more often you retreat below, and the longer you stay, the more the systems that support water use, channels, drainage, clean and dirty zones, have to be thought through like those of a real town. Derinkuyu shows signs of that kind of planning. Some channels seem designed not just to deliver water, but to take it away, grooves that could carry runoff, wash water, perhaps even waste towards lower isolated areas. This doesn't prove a fully engineered sewage system, and archaeologists are careful not to overstate it. Yet it does suggest that water was understood as both life-giving and dangerous, something to manage, direct, and, when necessary, keep out of living spaces. There's another subtle consequence of water planning underground, shapes how people cluster. Rooms near reliable wells would be attractive in a long crisis. Elders, children, essential workers, millers, bakers, religious figures might be assigned to those zones. Areas more vulnerable to contamination risk, closer to shafts that reach the surface, might be used differently. For animals, storage, or as buffers where, if something went wrong with the water, the damage would be contained. All of this rests on choices made in rock. But it only comes fully into focus when we think about the threats those choices answered. Derinkuyu is not just defending itself against blades and torches. It's defending itself against thirst, against poison, against the simple fact that any line connecting you to the surface, door, shaft, or well, is both a lifeline and a beacon, and just as the planners had to think about food, air and water, they had to think about everything that came with them. Animals, fodder, storage, quiet underground economy that made hiding possible in the first place. If you follow the plan down from those wells, the next thing you meet is not a throne room or a council chamber, it's a stable. At Derinkuyu, whole chambers near the upper levels are laid out with low carved troughs, tethering points, wide enough passages for hooves, not just bare human feet. Archaeologists generally agree these were spaces for animals, horses, donkeys, maybe cattle, maybe sheep and goats, depending on the period and local economy. That choice tells you a lot about how this city actually functioned. Livestock in pre-modern Cappadocia are not just walking food, they are engines. A donkey or horse means you can move grain and wine to market, bring building stone and timber from miles away. Evacuate children and goods more quickly when danger appears on the horizon. Cows and sheep are wealth on 4 legs, an insurance policy you can convert into grain, cloth, or favour. In a crisis, abandoning animals above ground would be walking away from your savings, your tractor, and half your pantry at once. The stables sit close to the entrances. That makes sense practically. You do not want to shepherd panicked, tired animals down to the deepest, narrowest corridors. You get them just far enough inside to be safe behind the rolling stone doors, give them air and water, and stop. Archways are broader. Here, ceilings higher. The floor often slopes gently, with channels that could help carry away liquid waste. The animals are outside the most crowded residential zones, but still within the defensive shell. The presence of stables also hints at how long people expected to stay below. Bringing a horse underground for a single night is an emergency. Designing permanent stalls, feeding spaces, and ramps suggests something else. Regular use, drills, anticipation. That going below with the animals was a known, practiced response in bad years. Once you picture those animals breathing and eating, another problem appears. How do you... Derinkuyu answers with storage. All through the complex, especially in the mid-levels, there are chambers with carved bins, niches, and what look like silos sunk into the floor. Rock here does something useful. It buffers temperature. Underground, especially below a certain depth, air stays relatively cool and stable year-round. That makes these rooms natural pantries. Foods that make sense in this environment are the classics of a pre-industrial siege diet. Grains that can be dried and sealed, pulses, dried fruits, nuts, salted or smoked meats, cheeses and clarified butter. Archaeologists have found pressing basins and grinding areas, evidence that the full cycle, harvest above, process, store, consume, could be partially relocated into the rock. If animals are sheltered, part of the stored food is really fodder. Barley, straw, chaff, leaves, whatever could keep the essential livestock alive long enough to be useful. People finally came back up. That implies planning on a seasonal scale. You don't improvise fodder reserves during a raid. Fill those bins in harvest time, year after year, assuming that not every season will be peaceful. Food isn't only about calories, though. At Derinkuyu, it's also about routine. In several underground cities of Cappadocia, including Derinkuyu, researchers identify what they interpret as wineries or wine-pressing areas. Basins cut into the floor where grapes could be crushed, channels to drain the juice, nearby pits to ferment or store liquid in amphorae. You don't dig those by accident. Winemaking is a slow, predictable process. Grapes ripen once a year. Juice becomes wine over weeks and months. Presence of wineries inside suggests two layers of behaviour. First, that these spaces were used extensively in peaceful times as cool, ideal processing and storage areas. Second, that in periods of refuge people could go on drinking what they had already prepared. Wine, in this context, is multi-purpose. It's safer to drink than dubious surface water. It preserves some nutrients. It can be traded, offered in ritual, used to seal agreements. A community that invests in rock-cut wineries is not just thinking about bare survival, preserving an economic product and a piece of its social rhythm. All of this, animals, grain, wine, creates a more awkward byproduct. Waste, thousands of people, plus livestock, in confined tunnels for weeks, produce an unromantic but serious problem. 2. Derinkuyu doesn't have the kind of elaborate sewer architecture you see in Roman cities. Some features suggest at least a basic separation of clean and dirty functions. Certain lower or peripheral chambers likely served as latrine areas. Slight floor slopes and shallow channels could guide liquid waste towards less critical zones. In some interpretations, specific vents and side shafts may have helped foul air drift away from core living spaces. That's harder to prove conclusively. What we do not see is rock-cut cesspits carefully lined and sealed, large-scale systems devoted solely to long-term sewage management. Combined with the arrangement of stables near the upper levels, this suggests that even in serious crises, underground stays were probably measured in weeks, or at most a few months, not in continuous, multi-year occupation. You can store grain for years if you manage pests and moisture. You can keep amphorae of wine in the cool dark almost indefinitely. But the human and animal bodies that consume them generate waste and disease risk that climb quickly in enclosed spaces. The architecture seems optimized for repeated, temporary refuges, intense periods of use bracketed by returns to the open air, where fields, pastures, and ordinary village life could resume. That rhythm brings us to an important perspective shift. Derinkuyu is often imagined as a separate world, hidden civilization under the feet of another. The evidence points to something more integrated, Turks. The same families who tended vineyards on the surface worked in those underground wineries, the same herders who grazed flocks on Cappadocia's plateaus led them, in danger, through the stone doors into the first-level stables. Grain grown in the sun moved down into the rock when harvests were good, then back up in lean times or during sieges. The underground economy was not independent of the surface. It was a backup layer of the same economy, redundant storage in case barns burned, protected animals in case raiders took the fields. Cool, safe processing spaces for products that mattered in both war and peace. Seen that way, Derinkuyu is less buried city from another world, and more a three-dimensional extension of a very ordinary one. Houses, vineyards, flocks, markets above. Stables, granaries, wineries, and refuge rooms below. One community spread vertically through rock, trying to make sure that when the surface failed them, their lives, and their livelihoods, did not vanish with a single bad season or a single passing army, and that community brought more than food and animals into the dark. It also carried its beliefs, its rituals, and its sacred spaces, carving them into the same stone that sheltered its wealth. If you walk a little farther in than the stables and the storage rooms, the rock changes mood. Derinkuyu has spaces that are hard to mistake for anything else. Chapels. They're not huge cathedrals. They're low, intimate, often barrel vaulted chambers with an apse carved into one end, sometimes with a simple altar block, sometimes with niches for lamps or icons, sometimes with a faint suggestion of a cross cut into the wall. In one of the larger examples, the room steps down in tiers, as if arranged to let several dozen people stand or kneel with their attention drawn to a single focal point. These aren't just leftover caverns someone decided to pray in. They are deliberately shaped worship spaces. That alone tells you something about the people using Derinkuyu in its later phases. They did not treat the underground only as a last-ditch bunker, planned for collective ritual. They expected to gather, to sing or chant, to listen to readings, perform the small repeated actions that bind a community together. And they made sure those actions had a place. By the time these chapels were carved, Cappadocia had a long and complicated relationship with Christianity. From at least the 4th century CE, this region became famous in church history for its monks, hermits, and theologians. Names like Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, the Cappadocian Fathers, are tied to this landscape of soft rock and wide skies. Above ground, hills and valleys are filled with later rock-cut churches, some still holding fragile frescoes from the Byzantine period. Christ, Pantocrator, saints, angels, donor portraits. Christianity here was not a minor, hidden cult. It was mainstream, argued over in councils, woven into imperial politics. Yet the world around those believers was rarely stable. Borders shifted. Arab-Byzantine wars pushed frontiers back and forth across Anatolia, Turkic raids, and later Seljuk expansion redrew the map again. Tax collectors came and went. Local power might be in the hands of a Byzantine official, one decade. An emir the next, a rival Byzantine faction after that. In that kind of environment, an underground refuge that already existed. A place with stables, food storage, controllable entrances, would have been irresistibly practical for Christian villagers. If you might have to vanish on short notice, you don't want your religious life to halt every time you roll the stone doors shut. You want baptism, Eucharist, daily prayers to be portable. Carving chapels into the rock solves that. It folds faith into the same vertical safety net that protects your animals and grain. Chapel underground could be used quietly, when above-ground worship was risky. During a raid under a hostile administration, or simply when gathering conspicuously in the open felt unwise. It could also serve in calmer times as a cool, protected sanctuary for monastic retreat, or as a secondary oratory linked to a surface church. But here we need to draw a careful line. Presence of Christian chapels shows clearly that Christians used Derinkuyu, especially in the Byzantine and possibly early medieval periods. What it does not prove is that Christians were the original excavators of the entire 18-story complex. The underground city is a palimpsest. Its earliest chambers may go back many centuries, perhaps to late Iron Age or Hellenistic communities, perhaps even earlier. Different levels and tunnels, different levels likely belong to different building episodes. The chapels we see today are almost certainly later modifications inserted into an existing maze. In some cases, you can even see that process of reshaping written in the stone itself. A storage room gains an apse. One wall is deepened and rounded, floor slightly levelled, a block left standing to serve as an altar. A corridor junction becomes a small oratory when someone carves a cross into the wall and cuts a bench along the side. A larger hall, once maybe a meeting room or communal workspace, organised with steps and partitions, so that it feels more like a nave and side aisles. Christian occupants weren't just passive inheritors of a mysterious underground. They were active renovators. They carved corners, proposed niches as icon shelves, incised Greek inscriptions, scratched prayers and symbols into pillars and doorjambs, took a defensive architecture and layered their own sacred geography onto it. This is something we see across Cappadocia. Tombs become chapels, abandoned dwellings become monastic cells. Pre-existing caves gain frescoes and liturgical fittings. Sacredness in this landscape is often something placed on top of older stone, not necessarily carved into it from the start. When you stand in an underground chapel at Derinkuyu, you're looking at least two stories at once. One story is clear, sometime in the Christian centuries. A community cared enough about worship to cut these spaces, to light lamps here, to recite familiar words in the muffled dark. The other story is older and harder to read. What this room was before first hollowed out its rough volume. What their beliefs looked like, whether they too had any concept of a sacred corner underground. The chapels are clues, not final answers. They prove that people didn't leave their gods or their doctrines at the entrance. Whatever they feared on the surface, tax raids, armies, persecution, or just bad luck, they carried into the depths a sense of order, ritual, meaning. They transformed parts of a pragmatic refuge into a vertical parish. But the stone keeps its secrets about the first hands that broke it. Crosses, apses, and inscriptions frame one chapter of Derinkuyu's religious life. They do not close the book on who began the excavation or what earlier rituals might have whispered through these tunnels long before anyone carved a Byzantine cross. To get closer to that, we have to step back from the chapels and look at the very oldest parts of the complex, the rougher chambers, the deep core levels, and ask a harder question. Who started all of this? And how far back does the story really go? If you want to know who first went underground here, you have to start with a slightly frustrating truth. Stone does not come with a date stamped on it. Archaeologists can't just walk into a chamber, look at the walls, and say, yes, 742 BCE, late autumn. They have to build a timeline from indirect traces, and underground cities make that especially tricky. One of the main tools is tool marks. Different technologies leave different scars. A metal pick cuts differently than a stone one. An iron chisel used with a hammer leaves patterns unlike a bronze blade. And both look different from a rough pounding with a hard gabbro cobble. In places like Derinkuyu, you can sometimes see parallel striations on the walls. The rhythm of blows frozen in the rock gives you a technological level, not a calendar date. Iron tool marks suggest you're not in the Bronze Age anymore. Very regular, fine chisel work might hint at. Later, more practiced stonecutters. But those tools could have been in use for centuries. Style drifts slowly. So archaeologists look for something more datable that's associated with the rock-cut space. Ceramics are especially helpful. Pottery styles change in ways we can often date within a few centuries, sometimes more precisely. If a chamber floor still has its original surface, you find broken pots sealed under it. You can say, this room cannot be older than the youngest sherd under that floor. If you find a trash pit dug into a corner during a later remodelling, filled with recognisable Byzantine wares, you know that particular modification belongs to that era. But an underground city is not a single moment. It's stacked interventions. Rooms get enlarged, ceilings raised, doors opened and then blocked again. Ventilation shafts are rerouted. Wells are deepened. Change cuts through earlier evidence. A later passage can slice through older debris, carrying newer material down into lower levels, unless you're extremely lucky with sealed layers. The archaeological record ends up scrambled by centuries of renovation. Historical texts can help, they come late. Writers in the Roman and Byzantine periods mention people hiding in underground places or subterranean refuges in Cappadocia. Later accounts talk about Christians in the region using caves and underground retreats. None of them, however, say, "This is when we first dug Derinkuyu. Here's the blueprint." So researchers try to weave together tool marks, ceramics, architecture, and whatever written hints exist into a story that feels coherent. Out of that puzzle, one hypothesis has emerged as the most commonly cited, that the earliest recognizable phases of Derinkuyu belong somewhere around the Phrygian period, roughly the early 1st millennium BCE. Why Phrygian? Partly because of timing and context. After the collapse of the late Bronze Age powers in Anatolia, including the Hittite Empire, there's a long, messy Iron Age, filled with small kingdoms, migrations and raids. Phrygians, whose heartland lay to the west and north, one of the better known of these groups. They're associated with rock-cut architecture, tombs, altars, facades carved into cliffs. The idea is that communities influenced by that broader culture, living in a landscape of soft tuff and constant insecurity, began to think vertically. If you can carve a tomb into rock, you can also carve a refuge. You dig cellars, then connected cellars, then rooms that are clearly not just for storage, stables, halls, the first rough living quarters. At some of the Cappadocian underground sites, earliest-looking spaces, simple, functional rooms with relatively crude tool marks and without obviously Christian features, seem to match an iron, age to early classical technological level. The Phrygian era attribution for Derinkuyu grows from that general pattern. It is a leading possibility because it fits with known historical turmoil, known rock-cut practices, and the basic look of some of the deepest, plainest spaces. But fits well is not the same as proven. Go back another step, and you reach an even more tantalizing suggestion that the story might begin in some form in the late Bronze Age under Hittite influence. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Hittite power reached across much of central Anatolia. Their texts mention enemy incursions, deportations, and the movement of populations. They knew siege warfare. They have wondered, if you're a village on the frontier of that kind of world, might you start hollowing out the ground as a backup plan? Here and there in Cappadocia, few underground spaces are tentatively linked to Hittite or Neo. Hittite periods, mainly because of nearby surface finds, ceramics, reliefs, inscriptions. If a small rock-cut refuge sits directly beneath a settlement layer, confidently dated to the late Bronze Age, it's reasonable to suspect the people living above had something to do with the digging. Extend that reasoning to Derinkuyu, and you get the Hittite hypothesis. The idea that the very earliest central tunnels, maybe just a handful of rooms and a shaft, were started by communities living in the shadow of Hittite politics, then massively expanded later by others. Here, though, the evidence grows thin. Tool marks in soft tuff do not easily tell you Bronze Age versus early Iron Age. Direct Hittite inscriptions in the underground levels are lacking. No sealed, clearly, Bronze Age occupation floor has been excavated in the core of Derinkuyu itself and securely tied to the first pick strikes. So when you hear confident statements that the Hittites built Derinkuyu, it's worth mentally translating that to host. Some researchers think an initial phase could be as early as the Hittite period, but we don't have hard proof. What almost everyone working on the site does agree on is that Derinkuyu is multi-generational. It was not carved in one campaign by one kingdom, then left untouched. It is much more like a living document written over perhaps 1,000 years or more. You can imagine the process in slow motion. An early community digs a few underground rooms close to the surface, maybe linked to cellars and storage pits. A later generation, facing a different kind of threat or simply more people, extends downward, adds a second cluster of chambers, maybe the first serious ventilation shafts. Centuries later again, someone deepens the well, widens corridors, cuts defensive features like rolling stone doors. Byzantines arrive and turn older rooms into chapels, carve crosses, and add inscriptions in Greek. Still later, villagers patch walls, repurpose spaces as wine presses or new stables. Beginnings, expansions, renovations. Each phase leaves its own texture. When you put all this together, a cautious summary looks something like this. It is plausible that the roots of Derinkuyu reach back at least to the early 1st millennium BCE in an Iron Age environment shaped by states like Phrygia and their neighbours. It is possible, though far from certain, that some kind of proto-refuge, simpler, shallower, far less extensive, existed already in the late Bronze Age under Hittite influence. It is very likely that the complex grew and changed dramatically during classical, Roman and especially Byzantine centuries, when we have the clearest evidence of use. What remains unproven is a single founding moment or a single founding people. No inscription announces, "We, the inhabitants of X, began this under King Y in year Z." The stone remembers only that many hands, from many centuries, have shaped it. And once you accept that Derinkuyu is not a one-time construction, but a layered project, another question comes into focus. What's happening above ground in those different eras that kept driving people back to the rock, pushing them to dig deeper, to add doors that roll, shafts that breathe, and rooms big enough to hold a whole village through a season of fear. By the time the Roman Empire had turned into what we call the Byzantine Empire, the world above Derinkuyu had changed again. Cities had grown, shrunk, moved. Languages had shifted. Belief systems had turned over more than once. One basic element of life in central Anatolia had stayed stubbornly the same. It was a frontier. Not all the time, not everywhere, off enough that people learned to think in terms of threats coming from somewhere else. Armies marching through, tax collectors arriving with soldiers, bandits, rebels. Nomadic confederations drifting in and out of imperial orbit. When scholars talk about a major phase of expansion and refinement at Derinkuyu, they usually point to the late Roman and especially Byzantine centuries. Over and over, the archaeology in Cappadocia shows the same pattern. Earlier, simpler underground cavities with few overt signs of Christianity. Then, layered on top of that, a clear Christian presence, crosses carved into door lintels, niches that look like altars, small chapels with apses, Greek inscriptions, wine presses and treading floors tied to a late antique and medieval economy. In other words, by the 1st millennium CE, people here weren't just ducking underground as a desperate last resort. They were integrating the underworld into a settled Christian landscape that was very much part of the Byzantine state. We know that from above ground evidence too. By the 4th century, Cappadocia was producing bishops, theologians, monasteries that mattered in the wider Christian world. Rock-cut churches honeycomb the cliffs. Frescoes bloom on ceilings. This is not a marginal nowhere. It's a populated, organised, tax-paying region inside a powerful empire. And yet that empire was under strain. From the 7th century onward, the eastern Mediterranean enters what historians often call an age of raids. After the rapid expansion of the early Islamic caliphates, Byzantium and the Arab states, settled into a grinding, centuries-long confrontation. The lines on the map moved back and forth. Fortified border zones, called thugger on the Arab side, and often just themes or frontier districts on the Byzantine side, ran roughly through parts of Anatolia and northern Syria. Cappadocia sat behind the main frontier, but not comfortably far behind. Arab armies and raiding parties could and did push deep into Anatolian territory. The sources describe summer campaigns, surprise winter attacks, fast-moving cavalry. They hit cities, forts, and sometimes countryside communities, taking prisoners, seizing livestock, burning what they couldn't carry. On the Byzantine side, there were counter-raids, punitive expeditions, forced population transfers, Even in quieter decades, locals lived with the knowledge that peace could end with a single riding column coming over the horizon. If you're a village in that world, what do you do? Many did. You could rely on imperial garrisons in larger towns. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they arrived too late. Or you could use what Cappadocia already offered in abundance. Soft rock and vertical space. Under these conditions, an underground city is not just an eccentric idea. It's a logical extension of a defensive strategy that already used caves, ravines, and cliff-cut refuges. Think about how such a system might actually work on a tense afternoon in the 8th century. You're in the vineyards outside town. Maybe the air is hot and still. Maybe nothing has happened for months. Then you see dust in the distance. A watchman on a ridge signals with a cloth, a horn, a shout. We don't have a manual that explains the exact code. Frontier societies all over the world develop fast communication. Smoke, fire beacons, bells, runners, riders. In a landscape as open as central Anatolia, a column of dust or a line of torches can say a lot. The warning spreads. People start moving. Children are pulled from courtyards. Animals are driven in from fields. Grain sacks, water skins, cherished tools and icons. Whatever can be carried quickly are grabbed. Some families probably had pre-packed baskets or bundles. When you live with the possibility of flight, you plan. They head not to some distant secret cave, but to something stitched into the fabric of everyday life. Stairways and courtyards that they walk past every day, cellars that are also gateways. The entrances to Derinkuyu and other underground complexes are often tucked beneath normal-looking buildings. Houses, stables, communal spaces, down they go. In a crisis, those narrow staircases that feel inconvenient on a market day become defensive assets. They choke movement, slow pursuers, create space for stubborn last stands, if it came to that. But mainly they buy time to seal the system. Famous rolling stone doors that we mentioned earlier. The huge circular plugs that can seal a passage now make sense as more than clever engineering tricks. You can imagine the sequence. Once enough people are through a particular choke point, designated defenders push the round stone into position from inside its niche, letting it drop into place with its central hole still open for observation or weapons. A few more, hands wedge it, brace it. On the far side, even a well-armed raiding party is now facing a smooth rock disc in a bottlenecked corridor, with no leverage and very little room to work tools. Behind that door are not just random tunnels, but a whole emergency layout. Stables near the upper levels, so animals can be pushed in fast. Storage chambers where grain, dried fruits, and oil jars wait for exactly this moment. Kitchens and hearths designed to vent smoke into the vast vertical lungs of the city. The ventilation shafts, so that fires can burn without choking everyone. Water comes from wells that punch down into the aquifer far below, often deliberately isolated from the surface wells to reduce the risk of poisoning by attackers. In some cases, the shaft you draw water from inside is not accessible at all from above. It is a hidden, one-side connection to the water table. Somewhere in the middle of this carved beehive, people gather to pray. The little chapels cut into Derinkuyu's rock, with their apses and carved crosses, make the most sense in a community that expects to be down here long enough, to need not just food and air, but ritual and reassurance. This is not a bunker for a frantic hour. It's a space where you might expect to ride out a season of risk. This is why many researchers talk about Byzantine expansion in Derinkuyu, not just in terms of more rooms, but in terms of more systems. You see more deliberate zoning, animal storage areas, storage clusters, communal halls that could function as meeting places or schools when life went below. You see elaborated airflow management with major ventilation shafts, some of them doubling as communication routes towards other sites like Kaimakli, carefully woven through the levels. Was every single one of these features carved under a specific emperor in response to a specific raid? We don't know, and the evidence doesn't really support that kind of neat labelling. Some stone doors might be late Roman, others could be early Byzantine. Still others may have been recut or reset centuries later. Ventilation shafts can be widened, rerouted, connected. Room first dug as storage in one century can become a chapel in another. Its walls recarved with frescoes and crosses, rather than tying Derinkuyu to one crisis. It's more realistic to see it as a multi-generation insurance policy that kept being renewed. Each age added its layer of anxiety to the rock. Hittite or Iron Age villagers worried about rival kingdoms and raiders on foot. Roman provincials fretted about bandits, tax uprisings, and the occasional invading army. Byzantine Christians had to think about fast cavalry raids, shifting frontiers, and the grinding uncertainty of a borderland caught between empires. Each time the threats changed, someone, at some point, walked down the old stairs with a lamp and thought, "We should widen this passage. We should add another door here. We should cut a new shaft, bring in more air. We should carve a chapel. We should lay in more storage." By the high medieval period, what had started as a small refuge had become a stacked 18-story habit of mind. A community that knows the sky can suddenly become dangerous. Builds depth into its architecture and its culture, teaches children the paths below as carefully as it teaches them the paths between fields. It treats rock not just as a foundation, but as a second inverted village held in reserve. Above ground, the empires that fought over Cappadocia rose and fell. Frontiers moved. Names changed. But the idea of going underground in bad times persisted, because in a world of raids, you never fully forget the value of being able to vanish. For all the drama of raids and empires, there's another pressure that never went away in Cappadocia, and it doesn't carry a sword. It's the weather. Central Anatolia today is often described as having a continental climate. Hot, dry summers and cold winters, with big swings between day and night. The deeper you look into historical climate data and proxy evidence. Tree rings, lake sediments, written descriptions from later periods. The more, it seems that those swings have been with this plateau for a very long time. Summer heat can push well above 30 degrees Celsius, sometimes into the 40s. Winter nights can drop far below freezing. Snow isn't constant, but when it comes, it can come hard. Winds sweep across the open plains. Storms can roll up quickly. Drought years string themselves together, if you live in stone houses on the surface. With limited fuel and no modern insulation, those swings are not just uncomfortable. They are dangerous. The rock beneath Cappadocia, though, tells a different story. One of the most quietly remarkable things about volcanic tuff is its thermal behaviour. Go down a few metres, into a cave, a cellar, a cut chamber, and the temperature starts to smooth out. Deeper still, into a place like Derinkuyu, and it hovers in a relatively narrow band all year, often somewhere around what we call cool but livable. Not cosy, not warm in the way a sunlit courtyard can be, but stable. That stability makes sense of some of the quiet uses of these underground spaces that don't have anything to do with horsemen on the horizon. Imagine you're a farmer or vintner here in, say, late antiquity. Host. Your harvest is the difference between getting through winter and going hungry. Grain spoils faster in fluctuating heat and humidity. Wine can turn if it gets too warm. Dried fruits, cheese, cured meat, all of them last longer if temperature and moisture stay within a predictable range. A chamber cut into tuff is by its nature a primitive refrigerator and pantry combined. You don't have to be at war to care deeply about that. You just have to have lived through one or two bad winters, or one summer where mould crawled through the grain jars faster than you could chase it. In that light, the underground city is not only a fortress, it's a vault. Protecting stored food from human enemies is one benefit. Protecting it from mice, insects, heat waves, and sudden cold snaps is another. Thick rock walls. Don't care whether the danger outside is a raiding party or a hailstorm that shreds your fields in an afternoon. Storms and extremes offer another set of quiet reasons to go below. On a high open plateau, when the wind turns sharp and the sky darkens, there are not many places to hide. A cave or carved chamber offers shelter from pelting ice, from dust storms, from sun, just as much as from spears. It's not hard to picture a summer day in which the warning is not a watchman's shout, but a sudden black line on the horizon, thunder building. People pull tools together, hustle animals toward shelter, and funnel not into a deep siege level, but into the upper spaces, stables just below the surface, communal rooms that function like cellars in normal times, and like storm shelters when the weather turns. Also the question of work. Seasonal labour in an agrarian landscape is always about timing, sowing, pruning, harvesting, processing, but there are off-seasons and bad days, stretches when the fields can't be worked. Underground, some tasks keep going. You can grind grain where the air is cool. You can repair tools in workshops cut into the rock. You can tend to wine in subterranean presses and storage rooms. Children can be watched, stories told, small crafts practiced even when snow is blowing sideways on the surface. In that sense, the underground spaces are not only refuges, they are buffers against the volatility of the environment. They smooth not just temperature, but time. They let a community shift some of its economic life into a place where the seasons bite less sharply. Doesn't mean that people wanted to live entirely below ground. Everything about Derinkuyu suggests that full-time, year-round habitation at depth would have been costly. Light is scarce and has to be bought with fuel. Smoke has to be managed carefully. Ventilation shafts help. But they also require maintenance and constant awareness. Moving people, animals, goods up and down steep staircases burns energy. Sanitation becomes more complex the longer you stay. If you had a choice, probably still prefer the surface, the sun, the open air, the straight path to your fields. So archaeologists tend to think in terms of mixed strategies. Most of the year, most people likely lived in surface settlements. Stone houses, courtyards, rock-cut rooms at the cliff face. The underground levels sat in reserve, used intensively in some seasons and barely at all in others. Generations. That pattern can shift in subtle ways. Perhaps at first there were only shallow storage caves, places to keep grain cool and hidden. Then someone cut a passage between two, to move more easily in bad weather. Maybe a family started sleeping in a lower room during the worst of winter cold. Another neighbour added a niche for a lamp. Then a small hearth. One year, a storm, or an unusually harsh winter pushed more families underground for longer. People noticed who coped better. Children learned that the safest place during hail or deep frost was not the exposed rooftop, but the familiar steps downward. Later, period of raiding or political instability layered on top of that already established pattern of seasonal retreat. Now, the same spaces used to protect grain from heat and mould could protect people from human threats. Doors thickened, corridors narrowed, deep levels expanded. By the time we get to the Byzantine centuries, the line between emergency refuge and integral part of settlement life had blurred. The result is what we see at Derinkuyu and across Cappadocia's 200-plus known underground sites, infrastructure that makes sense on multiple timescales. On the scale of an afternoon storm, you duck into a nearby stairway. On the scale of a hard winter, you move key activities, food processing, storage, some sleeping quarters, into the insulated rock. On the scale of a raid season or a frontier crisis, you take the whole village down for days or weeks. None of this requires a single, dramatic decision to become mole people. It grows out of small, practical choices made in a landscape that keeps reminding you that the future is hard to predict. A place where the sky can fry your crops, freeze your wells, or fill the air with dust teaches you to build in layers, to trust not just what you can see on the horizon, but what you have carved below it. Derinkuyu feels singular when you're standing in it. It's easy to imagine it as a one-off miracle, a freak outlier carved by some especially desperate or ingenious community. But as soon as you zoom out to the scale of the region, that illusion starts to crumble. Cappadocia is riddled with places like this. Archaeologists and surveyors have logged more than 200 underground settlements across the wider region. Settlement here doesn't mean a single cellar or a couple of storage rooms. It means multi-room, often multi-level complexes. Stairways, corridors, stables, wine presses, chapels, workshops, storage areas. On top of that, there are countless smaller carved spaces, solo chambers, rock-cut cellars, short refuge tunnels that don't quite qualify as full underground cities, but still plug into the same underground way of thinking. Once you realize that, Derinkuyu stops being a lone wonder and starts looking like the flagship node in a dense web. Network like that matters for the same reasons. A scattered metapopulation matters in biology, or a decentralized internet matters in technology, redundancy, communication, and resilience. If danger or famine or plague strikes one village, you don't want your only refuge to be a single point of failure. You want options. In Cappadocia, those options were literally carved into the landscape. Each town seems to have had access to its own underground space. Maybe just a modest complex with 1 or 2 levels. Maybe a more elaborate system like Cappadocia with its warrens of rooms. Maybe something as deep and intricate as Derinkuyu. Knowledge of how to use these places, how to manage air, light, food, waste, how to move animals, where put watch points and doors, could travel between communities just as easily as news of a raid or a failed harvest. If your cousins in the next valley had figured out a better way to carve a ventilation shaft or hang a rolling stone door, you didn't need to reinvent it. You could copy the idea into your own rock. Over generations, that kind of shared problem, solving turns into a regional tradition. Not just one community's solution, but a cultural habit of thinking in vertical layers and fold-back spaces. Then there are the tunnels. Locals long told stories of underground routes running for kilometres beneath Cappadocia, linking one town's refuge to another's. The most famous of these stories is the supposed tunnel between Derinkuyu and Cappadocia, often said to stretch roughly 8 or 9 kilometres in the dark. So what's actually there? Archaeologists do confirm that there are horizontal passages and side galleries extending out from the main complexes, and that in places different underground systems approach each other closely. Some shorter inter-settlement connections have been documented. You really can move from one cluster of rooms to another settlement system without surfacing. At Derinkuyu and Cappadocia, there are specific tunnel sections, specific tunnel directions that head in the right general direction and go on long enough to suggest more than just a storage annex. In some spots, the distance remaining between known endpoints is small enough that a connecting tunnel is plausible. But, as of now, the full, continuous Derinkuyu-Cappadocia tunnel you see in popular diagrams is not archaeologically confirmed end-to-end. Parts are real. The idea that it runs unbroken the whole way is, at this point, a strong local claim rather than a fully mapped fact. That ambiguity is revealing in its own way. Even if some of the longest claimed links turn out to be wishful thinking layered on top of real tunnels, the pattern is clear. People here weren't just digging straight down for safety. They were also probing sideways, exploring the possibility of underground movement across the landscape. And within that shared tradition, there is a lot of variation. Derinkuyu feels like a vertical machine. It's roughly 18 levels stacked down toward 85 metres. Narrow, steep stairways, vertical ventilation shafts, choke points, giant stone doors that can seal off entire levels. You sense a design priority of defence and controlled circulation. It reads like a fortress first, everything else second. Cappadocia, by contrast, spreads. Visitors often describe it as more horizontal, more sprawling. Rooms cluster around a series of main corridors that branch and loop. Many spaces are relatively broad rather than tall, better suited for daily work and storage than for funneling defenders into a narrow kill zone. There are stables, wine presses, storage areas, and living rooms in abundance, but the feeling is less of a high-rise bunker and more of a low, dense warren. Both have ventilation shafts, both have rolling stone doors, both have chapels, food processing spaces, and evidence of prolonged occupation. Yet their personalities are different, tailored to slightly different emphases. One leaning more toward deep, defensible refuge, the other toward extensive underground domestic and economic space. Now multiply that variation by hundreds of sites. Some Cappadocian underground complexes are just a few shallow levels with big stables near the entrance, clearly geared toward short-term shelter for people and animals during storms or brief threats. Others are rabbit, warren tangles of rooms and narrow tubes, more like labyrinths than houses. Many were extended, repurposed, and modified over centuries. Early Hellenistic storage caves torn deeper in Roman times, then retrofitted with Byzantine chapels and security features. Derinkuyu sits within that spectrum as one of the most extreme expressions of what this landscape can do, but not as an isolated anomaly. Its mystery. Why it's so deep, who organised such a massive excavation, how it was coordinated and maintained, belongs to a larger mystery about Cappadocia as a system. How an entire region converged, slowly and experimentally, on the idea that safety, food, faith, and memory could all be layered underground. How people learned not just to hide in the rock, but to think with it. Which brings us back to the question that hangs over every level and every tunnel. What, exactly, was all of this protecting them from? If you only look at the architecture, it's tempting to imagine one single nightmare scenario that explains everything. Some vast invading army, some apocalyptic war, some once-in-a-millennium persecution that drove people underground and kept them there for months at a time. One cause, one solution. Dig an 18-story refuge. Seal the doors, wait it out. History is rarely that tidy. When you line up what we actually know about Cappadocia across the last 3,000 years or so, you don't see one disaster. You see categories of danger that keep repeating in different costumes. The first is raiding. This part of central Anatolia sat between richer, poor, more heavily populated regions. The great agricultural basins to the west, the routes toward Syria and Mesopotamia to the southeast, the steppe worlds beyond the Black Sea to the north. Armies, caravans, and nomadic groups all moved through, and wherever you get valuable flow, you get people willing to take it by force. You don't need a formal war for that. Small mounted bands, seasonal raiders, opportunistic neighbours. Any of them could sweep through a valley, grab animals, grain, and prisoners, and be gone in a day. For that kind of threat, an underground complex isn't a doomsday bunker. It's a way to deny the raider what they came for. You hear a warning horn, or you see smoke from the next village. People move fast. Animals are herded down into the stables near the entrance. Granaries, that usually serve as cool, dry storage, become the entire food supply. The big stone door is rolled across the main access point. Smaller choke points are sealed behind it. If the raiders crest the ridge, what do they see? A mostly empty town, maybe a few token buildings left to loot. Not much grain in the visible storerooms, very few animals in the open. The real wealth, people, livestock, seed grain, tools, is now behind rock. Then there's wartime disruption. Cappadocia spent centuries as someone's frontier, Achaemenid Persian satrapy, Hellenistic kingdom, Roman client state, Byzantine theme. Each of those political layers brought tax collectors, soldiers, and sometimes large, organised campaigns. In late Roman and Byzantine times, this whole region also lay on or near the fault line between Christian polities to the west and various powers to the east and south, Sasanian Persians, later Arab and Turkish forces. Big wars tend to move in waves. Before the main army even arrives, you can have foraging parties stripping the countryside, auxiliary troops living off the land, deserters and bandits looking for easy targets. After a battle, you can have defeated soldiers scattering through rural districts, desperate and armed. An underground city is an answer to that kind of drawn-out instability. If a campaign is passing through over weeks or months, you might not be hiding from a single moment of catastrophe so much as shaving the top off the danger curve. Families might sleep below on nights when rumours are bad. Valuable animals might be kept in underground stables for an entire campaigning season. Work above ground continues in small bursts. Fields still need tending, but the community's centre of gravity shifts downward whenever things feel uncertain. The third category is local violence. You don't need imperial armies or foreign raiders to make a refuge useful. Feuds, banditry, disputes over water and pasture. Even plain old crime could make having a defensible fallback space attractive. If you have a rock-cut entrance that can be sealed from the inside by a few adults, you suddenly have a place where the vulnerable, children, elders, the injured, can be held safe while whatever is happening above plays out. Layered onto all of that is persecution. By the Byzantine period, Derinkuyu's underground chapels and crosses make it clear that Christians were using the space not just for storage but for worship. Later, after the region's gradual Islamization and Turkification, it continued to host Christian communities. Greek, speaking and Armenian, living as religious, minorities under different regimes. Was the city primarily a persecution refuge? Here the evidence becomes murkier. Post. We do have written accounts from wider Anatolia of Christians sheltering in caves and underground spaces during specific waves of violence. Arab raids into Byzantine territory, later periods of intercommunal tension in Ottoman and post-Ottoman times. We also have local oral histories that remember hiding underground in times of trouble, sometimes explicitly framed as threats from religious outsiders. But the architecture itself is multi-tool rather than single-use. Rolling stone doors, narrow strangling corridors, hidden ventilation shafts. You can deploy those whether you're hiding from a passing army that does care what you believe, or from a state that suddenly does. The existence of chapels and religious symbols tells us about who used the space during certain centuries. It doesn't lock in a single motive for whoever first cut those levels centuries earlier. Whatever the specific threat, concealment was the constant technique. Derinkuyu's main entrances are not giant, obvious, monumental gates. They are modest doorways tucked into courtyards and houses. Once you slip inside and roll the stone across, the opening just looks like another patch of rock. Vertical shafts are narrow and often open into enclosed spaces at the surface. Not wide, smoking chimneys advertising life below. Life inside had to be quiet. If 100 people spread across a few levels talk in low voices, sound doesn't carry far. But if you sing, shout, bang metal, run animals up and down stairways, the rock will relay that noise. So practices develop. Large groups at night. Time noisy work for safer periods. Keep the most vulnerable and least disciplined. Children, young animals, deeper inside during danger. Smoke is the same problem in a different form, an 18th story. An underground city needs fire for cooking and warmth, but heavy smoke funneled into one shaft becomes a black signal flag. Solutions likely included using charcoal, which burns with less visible smoke, restricting open flame to certain rooms near vent points, cooking at night, or during poor visibility. Sometimes accepting cold food when the risk of being seen was too high. When you put all of this together, hiding looks less like a single dramatic act and more like a set of habits for keeping continuity intact. Continuity of people, making sure that if trouble sweeps through, the human fabric of the community doesn't tear beyond repair. Continuity of faith, chapels, and carved crosses underground are not just emergency shelters for belief. They're a way of saying that even when you withdraw, carry ritual, prayer, and teaching with you. Continuity of food, seed grain stored in deep, cool rooms, wine and oil in rock-cut presses and vats, dried goods kept safe from both climate and plunder. If fields are burned or harvests stolen one year, what's underground can bridge the gap. Continuity of animals, sheep, goats, maybe even some cattle hidden in the first levels, fed from stored fodder. They're not just meat, they're milk, wool, traction, and wealth. Losing them can break a family for generations. Over centuries, the same basic architecture could be repurposed again and again. A Hellenistic-era storage cave might become a Roma-era refuge from bandits. Later, Byzantine engineers deepen it, adding more levels, more doors, more chapels, as frontier warfare intensifies. In Seljuk or Ottoman times, Christian minorities use the same passages in yet another round of instability. Each generation carves a little more, adapts a little more, overlays its own fears and hopes onto the same stone. So when we ask what Derinkuyu was hiding from, the honest answer is, it was hiding from whatever the century happened to throw at it. Raids, campaigns, local feuds, tax collectors gone violent, targeted persecution in bad years. All of those fit the evidence. None of them, alone, exhaust it. The city's genius is that it didn't need a single, perfect enemy to justify its existence. It was a flexible refuge system, ready to meet different dangers in different eras, always with the same underlying goal. To make sure that, when the trouble passed over the land above, still a community left to climb the stairs and open the doors. Whenever a place is this strange, this elaborate, and this hard to see in its entirety, other kinds of stories rush in to fill the gaps. Derinkuyu is no exception. Spend a little time online, and you'll find claims that the city is tens of thousands of years older than any archaeologist will admit, that it was built by a lost civilization wiped out in some global cataclysm, that it's proof of technology we no longer understand, or even shelter from visitors who didn't come from Earth at all. Those stories are not coming out of nowhere. They're doing something for us. Part of the appeal is scale. An 18-level complex, dropping 85 meters into the rock, room for maybe 20,000 people and animals, connected into a wider network of 200-plus underground sites across Cappadocia. It feels bigger than ordinary history. Bigger than anything we imagine a few villages with hand tools could accomplish. There's also the problem of the missing author. We don't have a neat inscription over the entrance saying, built by Sir and Sir in the year X, King Y, for this exact purpose. We have layers, tool marks, pottery fragments, radiocarbon, dates from organic material in plaster and mortar, we have stylistic comparisons. This doorway looks late. Roman, that chapel is clearly Byzantine. This tunnel link toward Kaymakli looks medieval, but the first moment when someone decided to carve a staircase downward instead of a storage niche. That's lost. Where documentation is thin, imagination grows thick. Mainstream archaeology, though, isn't completely blind down here. It just moves slowly and stays close to what can actually be checked. When researchers date Derinkuyu, they're not picking numbers out of the air. They're looking at things like pottery shards embedded in the fill of a wall, soot layers on ceilings that can be dated using radiocarbon, tool marks that match Iron Age or Roman period chisels rather than Bronze Age or earlier ones, comparing Derinkuyu's features to other sites with better stratigraphy and more datable material. In that framework, consensus picture looks something like this. People were carving small underground spaces in Cappadocia, at least by the early 1st millennium BCE, probably earlier. Simple storage rooms, maybe short refuges. By Hellenistic and Roman times, some of these expanded into multi-level complexes, really large-scale integration at Derinkuyu. The deep ventilation shafts, the big stables, the more elaborate rolling stone doors, the chapels, belongs mostly to late Roman and especially Byzantine periods, when we know from written sources that this frontier was violent and unstable. What it does not support is a fully formed 18-story city built, say, 20,000 years ago and merely reused later. There's no diagnostic Paleolithic or early Holocene material in primary construction layers, tools from that era. No consistent pattern of extremely ancient radiocarbon dates buried in the original fabric of the city. That doesn't mean humans weren't in Cappadocia that early. They were. It just means there's no solid evidence that those very early inhabitants carved Derinkuyu as we see it today. A lot of the supposedly impossible features look different when you take time seriously. Take the sheer volume of rock removed. If you imagine one gigantic construction project with thousands of workers carving non-stop until it's done, it feels incredible in the literal sense of the word. But scale that down. Imagine a community of a few hundred people adding to an existing complex a little bit each generation. One new chamber here for a growing family. Another stable there. After a bad winter reminds everyone how valuable extra animal space can be. Deeper level, slowly cut as raids or wars grow worse and people feel the need for more protected storage. Even with simple iron tools, a handful of workers can remove a surprising amount of soft volcanic tuff in a year. Spread that effort across centuries, and 18 levels stop looking supernatural. They look like the accumulated patience of many lifetimes. The same is true for the engineering. Ventilation shafts that seem impossibly clever are usually the product of trial and error. You carve a test shaft. If it doesn't draw air well, modify it. Widen it, connect it to a second tunnel. The design we admire is the version that survived after many less effective attempts were patched, abandoned, or recut. Rolling stone doors feel exotic, but they're built on simple principles: a round, heavy slab, a recessed groove, pinhole to see through and stab through. These are the kinds of solutions people all over the world arrive at when they need to block a passage using the materials they have, and then there are later modifications. A cramped storage cave from one era becomes, in another, the base of a long stairway. A bare room gains plastered walls, a cross, and an apse when a Christian community turns it into a chapel. A narrow tunnel is widened in Ottoman. times when people with different tools and different needs come through. What looks like a single, possibly coherent project is often the final snapshot of a constantly edited environment. This doesn't mean we have all the answers, or that archaeology is a finished book. It isn't. There are still real mysteries underground. There are side passages at Derinkuyu that remain only partially explored. There are deeper levels that may hold earlier phases of use, art, questions about how exactly the labour was organised, how far the tunnel networks truly run between towns, how common simultaneous occupation was. Across the 200-plus underground sites in the region, enjoying those mysteries responsibly means holding two thoughts at once. First, we don't know everything. There may be surprises in the next excavation season, or the next generation of dating techniques that shift details of the story we're telling now. Second, not knowing everything does not mean that any story is equally likely. When someone claims that Derinkuyu is 50,000 years old and built with technologies we can't reproduce, the burden is on that claim to bring evidence at least as strong as the evidence we have for a more recent incremental origin. So far, it hasn't. You can still feel the pull of the other stories. They're part of how we process awe. A lost civilization, strange devices in the dark, people hiding from incomprehensible forces. That's our narrative brain trying to match the scale of the structure with the scale of drama. Once you've walked through the evidence, an older, quieter wonder emerges. Even if Derinkuyu is only a few millennia old, represents an extraordinary level of planning and patience. Generations willing to spend precious time they could have spent on fields, trade, or building above ground, chiseling away in the dark, for dangers that might not come this year, or next, or even in their lifetimes. Vanished super civilization is required to make that impressive. Ordinary people did this. Farmers, shepherds, stonemasons, priests. They looked at unstable centuries and decided that one answer was to push downward to hollow safety out of the earth. One swing of the hammer at a time. In some ways, that's a more demanding story than any about lost technology. It asks us to imagine not one moment of spectacular genius, but thousands of small, stubborn decisions made without certainty in flickering light. Stay with that image for a moment. A line of workers on a half-finished stairway, air cool and thin, passing baskets of stone up toward the surface, someone above lowering a lamp, someone below chipping at an outline that will, if they do it right, become a doorway. Their grandchildren will trust with their lives. This, more than any fringe theory, is the core mystery Derinkuyu offers, that human beings, with simple tools and complicated fears, can reshape the very ground they stand on to keep a future alive they will never see. From here, we can go back to the evidence, to what we can actually say with some confidence about who began this project, and how far back its roots really go. There are a few things about Derinkuyu that sit on relatively solid ground. We know it stepped back into the light in 1963, when a man renovating his house knocked through a wall and found not just a forgotten room, but the upper edge of a buried city. Since then, surveys and excavations have mapped out roughly 18 levels of passages, chambers and shafts, plunging about 85 metres down. Not all of those levels are open to the public, and not all are equally well understood, but the broad shape is clear. We can point to major features with some confidence. Long stairways connecting tier after tier, deep ventilation shafts that kept air, moving through dense clusters of rooms. Wells and cisterns, some carefully walled off so that water stayed safe even if the surface was compromised. Stables for animals, storage rooms, wineries, kitchens, communal spaces and chapels that speak to shared ritual life in the dark. Massive rolling stone doors that could, in the right moment, turn open corridors into dead ends. We can also say that this was not the frozen achievement of one generation. Tool marks, architectural styles, datable material all point to a multi-phase history. Small underground spaces in Cappadocia appear by at least the early 1st millennium BCE, perhaps earlier. Over time, some of those modest refuges and storage caves were expanded, linked, recut. By late Roman and especially Byzantine periods, Derinkuyu had become a deep integrated complex plugged into a regional network of more than 200 underground sites. Some with known tunnel links, like the one toward Kaimakli. So when we talk about who built Derinkuyu, the most defensible answer is many different communities over many centuries, each adding, repairing, repurposing in response to the needs and fears of their own time. The leading scenarios all share that layered timeline. One emphasizes gradual deepening. Iron Age or early classical people start with simple cellars and bolt holes. Hellenistic and Roman communities enlarge them. Byzantine, frontier populations facing raids and religious conflict drive the complex down to its impressive depth. Another picture shifts the emphasis slightly earlier, imagining substantial pre-Roman carving. Perhaps in late Iron Age or early Persian period Cappadocia, which Byzantine groups later inherit and systematize. What they have in common is that none requires a single mastermind civilization. They see Derinkuyu as an evolving solution, habit of going underground that stretched across political regimes and religious changes, accumulating into the 18-story city we see now. Then there are the parts, still in shadow. We do not yet have a firm date for the very first stairway, the moment when someone went beyond a storage niche and committed to living space below. The earliest phases are buried under centuries of reworking, deeper until carefully controlled excavations are done, and until more datable material turns up. Earliest excavation will remain a range, not a clean number. We also don't fully understand occupancy patterns. Was Derinkuyu ever filled close to its estimated capacity of 20,000 people plus livestock? Or was that theoretical, a maximum for extreme crisis? Were most levels used only episodically, for short periods during raids, daily life centered above ground? How often were multiple underground cities in the region occupied at the same time, forming a true hidden network, rather than isolated refuges? Specific trigger events are hazier still. We can link broad waves of expansion to known periods of instability. Arab-Byzantine conflicts, later Turkic raids, local feuds, heavy taxation, even harsh winters and banditry. But matching a particular rolling stone door, or a new chapel, to a named campaign in a chronicle is mostly beyond us. There are also literal unanswered questions behind closed rock. Some side tunnels remain blocked or unsafe to enter. Deeper levels may preserve older arrangements that have not yet been disturbed by tourism or modern reinforcement. Before we head into the final stretch of this story, a quick note. If you'd like to wander through more long, quiet histories like this one, there's a book version available at sleepytimehistory.com. And for this week, there's a small discount there for listeners. No rush, just something to explore if this kind of slow archaeology helps you drift. Standing back, the mix of knowns and unknowns at Derinkuyu is not a flaw in the story. It's part of its power. The confirmed pieces. The rediscovery in 1963, the 18 levels down to 85 metres. The wells and chapels and rolling doors, the long, layered construction history. Give us enough to see real people at work. Ordinary tools, ordinary fears, extraordinary persistence, gaps invite a different kind of attention. They remind us that history is not a finished map, but an active investigation. Some of the most interesting truths may still be waiting behind a wall we haven't yet knocked through, or in a soot layer we haven't yet dated. Woots, and they nudge us toward a quieter kind of wonder. Not the certainty of a single dramatic answer, but the patience to live with partial light, to let Derinkuyu be, at the same time, a well-studied Byzantine refuge, a palimpsest of older efforts, a place where some questions are still content to sit in the dark. We'll stay with that feeling a little longer, think about what it means. For us up here, to know that deep below, in the cooled heart of an old volcano, a city still waits with more secrets than certainties. So let's come back one last time to that first moment. A man in 1963, in a house in Cappadocia, breaks through a wall. Dust, stone, a hidden space. But the remarkable part is what came after, not a small cellar, not a forgotten room. A vertical world, descending through roughly 18 levels to about 85 metres, air moving through ancient shafts, water pulled from deep wells, and passageways that keep unfolding into more rooms, more chambers, more questions. Derinkuyu holds us because it shows what people will do when they decide not to surrender. It isn't just the engineering, that alone is quietly astonishing. Those ventilation shafts cut with enough foresight that air can still circulate today, protected. So that even if enemies poisoned the surface, families below could drink. Rolling stone doors carved so precisely that a few people could seal off passages against an army. All of this multiplied and adjusted over centuries without modern surveying equipment or machine power. Just hand tools, patience, a collective memory that knew where to dig, where to stop, and how not to bring the whole thing down on their heads. But the real gravity of Derinkuyu is social. When you look at those stables, those storage rooms, those chapels, you're seeing a choice was worth the effort to make a place where an entire community could descend together. Elders, children, animals, food stores, sacred spaces, people prepared to compress their lives into rock for days or weeks at a time, not as isolated individuals, but as a linked network stretching across Cappadocia and beyond. Kaimakli, to the north, dozens of other underground cities across the region, more than 200 known sites, some certainly still half mapped. The city under your feet is the visible part of that decision. The rest is invisible. Agreements, routines, stories passed down about when to go below and when to emerge, what to carry, how to share, sleeps nearest the doors. And then there's the uncertainty, the part our minds keep circling back to. We don't really know who first widened a storage niche into a living room. We don't know whether Derinkuyu ever truly held something like 20,000 people, plus livestock, pressed into the rock in a moment of crisis, or whether most of its life was quieter. Fewer inhabitants, shorter stays, long stretches of emptiness between alarms. We don't know precisely how much older, deeper, stranger some of the blocked levels might be. That unresolved space is part of why it lingers. Derinkuyu sits at a sweet point between explanation and mystery. Enough evidence to ground the story in Byzantine frontiers, in late Roman fear, in earlier experiments with living below. Enough gaps to leave room for careful speculation, and, for some, more imaginative theories about very ancient origins or lost builders. We can say, those fringe ideas are not supported by the current archaeology, but we can also say, the rock still holds chapters we haven't read. If you've stayed with this story all the way down and all the way back up, been doing a kind of small excavation of your own, moving slowly, setting aside what doesn't fit, keeping some questions open. Before we close, a gentle request. If this slow walk through an underground city has kept you company, it helps a lot if you tap like, leave a comment and subscribe. It's a quiet way of telling the algorithm that there's room here for long, patient histories. And if you feel like sharing a little more, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Midnight in a small apartment, early morning on a commute, earbuds in a dark room. Those details turn this from a monologue into a conversation. This kind of deep sleep, friendly archaeology feels like your kind of thing. There's also a book that goes further back into prehistory, into the long, strange story of how humans almost didn't make it, and what that near ending left in our bones and our myths. You can read more about it or pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com whenever you're ready. For now, imagine the lights going off again in that stairwell, the last footsteps echoing away, air drifting through the shafts, water resting cool in the cisterns, rolling stone doors waiting in their grooves. Above, life goes on, cars, phones, streetlights, all the noise of a surface world in motion.